Good morning. What a difference a week makes. Last Sunday, as I looked out the windows, I saw the approaching solid form of moisture. I call it the apex gut. I looked up the apex gut and it was completely solid white. And later on, it took a while, but it did fall upon us and we had a blanket of white for the week. This morning, we have the liquid form of moisture, and we have a bit of rain falling out there. So, living in the Okanagan in the wintertime. I remember as a young person, I don't think I ever thought that I was going to be living in my parents' basement for all of my life, but that's an interesting find. But I remember hearing on a number of occasions from a number of voices who I would have considered to be wise voices, words something to this effect: mind the company you keep. Mind the company you keep. And as I began to journey through my life and move out onto my own, those are words that stuck with me. But they're ancient words. Aesop said, "A man is known by the company that he keeps." Woodrow Wilson said, "Your enlightenment depends on the company you keep. You do not know the world until you know the men who have possessed it and tried its wares before you were ever given your brief run upon it." Colin Powell said, "A mirror reflects a man's face, but what he is really like is shown by the kind of friends he chooses." I came across this by that wonderful author, Unknown. Make sure everyone in your boat is rowing and not drilling holes when you're not looking. Know your circle. Kenneth Ortiz says, "Be wary of the company you keep, for they are a reflection of who you are or who you want to become." Keeping company with Jesus is a theme that we are focusing upon throughout this year, 2021. And a lot of our journey will be from the Gospel of Mark as we look at Jesus through the eyes of Mark. A focus on how we can be forming ourselves spiritually, reflecting on the seasons of the church year indeed, but also upon some of the spiritual disciplines and practices as we journey through our times together here on Sunday mornings. Our text this morning comes from the early chapter of Mark chapter 1, as we continue to look at the words that Mark give us of Jesus' journey. We begin to pick up the story in the 21st verse of chapter 1 this morning. They went to Capernaum. And when the Sabbath came, Jesus went into the synagogue and began to teach. The people were amazed at his teaching because he taught them as one who had authority, not as the teachers of the law. And just then a man in their synagogue who was possessed by an evil spirit cried out, "What do you want with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." "Be quiet," said Jesus sternly. "Come out of him." The evil spirit shook the man violently and came out of him with a shriek. And the people were all so amazed that they asked each other, "What is this? A new teaching and with authority. He even gives orders to evil spirits, and they obey him. And news about him spread quickly over the whole region of Galilee. In today's lesson from Mark's Gospel, Jesus begins his public ministry. And he begins it by teaching in the synagogue. And his teaching was met by astonishment. They were amazed. They were astounded, is how Mark puts it. Their surprise was not so much at what he taught, but at the authority with which he taught it. For he taught them as one having authority. And they were all amazed and kept asking one another, "What is this?" Jesus and his band of fresh recruits. Last week, Clark shared with us those opening words of the command that Jesus placed upon the individuals he encountered. Come, follow me. The calling to become a part of the band of disciples that Jesus would have with him as he journeyed through his years of ministry. But he has his band of fresh recruits, and we're told that they've gone to Capernaum, and they enter the synagogue at Capernaum. Now Capernaum was the largest of the many fishing towns surrounding the Sea of Galilee. And the commerce related to the sea made Capernaum a thriving town and a place where the local legion or headquarters of the Roman troops was centered. So the people living in that town had to put up with a lot of heathen sin and evil and decadence because of the influx of both the commerce and the Roman centurions being there. Mark does not clue us in on about what Jesus was teaching. Instead, the story remains tightly focused upon Jesus' authority. Now, the word for authority comes from the Greek word exousia, used 8 other times in the book of Mark. So it was something that was important for Mark to let us know of the authority of Jesus. It means freedom and power to act however one wants. And in this context, it has an added meaning of being sure that what one says is true. In other words, Jesus knew exactly what he was talking about. The issue of power and authority and glory is a massive one in our world today, as it's always been. Power by our understanding is power over, the capacity to conquer, to coerce, or to humiliate. Authority is the ability to command and to direct others and to not be under the command of others. To be on top. And in service of this kind of power, dictators have brought suffering on their own peoples. Corrupt politicians and business leaders have feathered their own nests, while ordinary people have to pay the consequences for their greed. In service of this power, wars are fought and nations deny their connectedness. In service of this power, physical and emotional abuse which rears its ugly head in families and relationships and workplaces. In service of this power, religious organizations have lobbied governments, excluded those of different creeds or ideologies, and have pronounced judgment on the world. This quest for this kind of power has created systems like Nazism and apartheid and all sorts of destructive nationalisms. Napoleon was right when he said that power corrupts. But when Jesus reveals God's power and God's glory, it is an authority of a whole different order. It is not a power over, nor is it a manipulative power under. Rather, Jesus calls people into God's liberating community, collaborative, shared power. This is why Paul encourages the believers in Corinth not just to enjoy their freedom, but to consider its effects on others and to serve them. That's why Jesus' teaching was so captivating for the people. He called them. He called them to share in God's reign, shared power and authority. And he revealed the freedom that it offers. And he did not use his power to control, to oppress, and to judge. In a world where a few powerful nations use their power to shape the world's systems in their favor, where super wealthy people resist carrying larger tax burdens for the sake of those who have less, and where strong economies dictate the terms of trade to smaller and weaker ones, we could do with a lesson in power from Jesus. And as those who seek to follow Christ, we can work within our systems to collaborate with others, whoever they may be, to work for greater justice and equality without trying to control things according to our agendas, or fearing that we will somehow lose if we share our power. It's very easy to stand in judgment on those who see justice differently than we might. But all that simply does is polarizes our world even more. It may be that Christ's example calls us to stand with those who still believe in the idols of wealth and power, while gently revealing the freedom of Christ. The freedom of Christ through our grace and our love and our servanthood. We see in our text this morning three groups, or three voices. We hear the voice of the synagogue goers, taking the dramatic role of the Greek chorus. They express how impressed they are with Jesus' authoritative teachings. And they are astounded at his teachings because it had authority. He's not simply passing on to them the traditions that he had learned, but confidently presenting his interpretations. These folks were used to hearing those voices of traditions being passed on. But we, as readers, are not surprised, since the voice of the narrator of the Gospel of Mark has already told us who Jesus is. Right at the very outset of the Gospel, we're told that Jesus is the Son of God. The implication is that the authority of Jesus to teach and to exercise and to heal comes from the Spirit of God, whose power is working in and through him. But the synagogue goers, they aren't quite ready to go that far in affirming Jesus' identity. But someone else is. Someone else in this account is. For we hear the voice of the unclean spirit. Mark loves irony. And this is a good example of it. It is ironic that an unclean spirit is the first one to voice his recognition of who Jesus is. What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are. I know who you are. The Holy One of God. The Holy One of God. The unclean spirit is scared. You can read that pretty easily in the text. The unclean spirit is scared. We hear it in his voice, the trembling beneath the swagger, the fear lurking in the fury. He recognizes that an eviction notice is coming when he sees Jesus. Might those internal fears be signs for us as well, as ones worth paying extra attention to? But the unclean spirit recognizes the sound of the real enemy's voice, and the real enemy of chaos and sin is Jesus. The enemy of the unclean spirit is Jesus. When that which is sinful and unclean in our lives recognizes that Jesus is coming too close for comfort, we react. We resist. And that goes for individuals and for communities. We react with uneasiness. Emotions of an ugly nature get stirred up. Maybe it would be best if we named our central anxiety and remembered the saving authority of God's voice. The one whose voice and presence can drive out our demons is in the house. Amid all of the competing voices that we hear, we should listen to his. In this season of pandemic and loss, what possesses us? What wreaks havoc in our hearts and minds? What distorts our humanity? These forces might not leave our lives without a fight, but the Jesus of Mark's gospel will do battle for us if we'll let him. The third voice is the voice of Jesus. Mark, as I said, never tells us what Jesus was saying. It must have been profound to catch the attention of the synagogue goers. All we know is that he entered the synagogue, taught with an authority, and his listeners found that authority astonishing and understood that authority when they saw the exorcism that rattled everyone who witnessed it. Is this a character we can relate to at all? Or is Jesus' role in this story so completely enshrined in his divinity and in his power that there's nothing for us to imitate in this? I mean, after all, we don't go around doing what Jesus did that day, do we? But I thought about that this week. What is here, if this is who I am called to keep company with? What is Jesus saying to us this morning? Let me suggest a couple of things. First, Jesus didn't use his authority to self-glorify or to amass power. He used it only to heal, only to free, only to serve, and to empower those around him. And maybe this is precisely why his audience found him so compelling. His was the authority of a servant king. He had no political power, and he sought none. He had no earthly throne or kingdom to speak of, but he had an integrity and a generosity that compelled people to listen and to follow him. And a second thing that comes to mind is that in this story, Jesus stepped directly into the pain. He stepped directly into the rage and the ugliness and the horror at the heart of this story. There wasn't anything squeamish about Jesus. He didn't flinch. His brand of holiness didn't require him to keep his hands clean. He was in the fear, in the midst of the sickness, in the nightmare, ready to engage anything that diminished the lives of those he loved. Anything. Yes, he preached and taught with great effectiveness to the faithful, but he also spoke the unclean spirit's language. He listened to its cries, and he rebuked it for the sake of a broken man's health and sanity. Consider the question the Spirit asked before it left its victim. What have you to do with us? What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? And there's only one answer to that question. Only one answer. Everything. I have everything to do with you. For wherever pain is, wherever darkness is, wherever torment is, God is. God is. God has everything to do with us, even and maybe especially when we're at our worst. When the shadows overwhelm us, when the demons shriek the loudest, when the hype of liberation feels like nothing more than fantasy. That is when Jesus' authority brings the walls down. Jesus comes to remove the unclean spirits from all of us. To attack that line that goes down the middle of our hearts. I think it was Alexander Solzhenitsyn who said something to the effect that the line between good and evil does not go between countries or empires. It does not go between religions or political systems. The line between good and evil goes right down the middle of every human heart. And like the man with the unclean spirit, we often wish the holy would leave us alone, and so we can live our lives of selfishness or materialism or devotion to the pleasures that are so readily available for us in the world in which we live. But as the demon recognized in the story, Jesus, the living Word of God, has come to us on a mission of destruction with an agenda of rebellion. The Word comes to tear down the walls of separation that keep us apart. The Word comes to break the chains that keep us in bondage to badness. The Word comes to wipe out the diseases of the soul that keep us from knowing God's love and from loving one another. Yes, the living Word, which is the Christ, comes to destroy. But He destroys in order to rebuild, to reconstruct, to recreate, to remake us in the image of God. And this brings us back to the question of authority. For we live in an age of questions about most forms of authority that we have around us. Many are jaded and others simply skeptical. Governments come and go and seem to focus more on keeping power than touching lives. People have lost faith in the institutional church. Too many scandals have rocked it. Survival mold has taken hold. We wonder what the future holds. We get nervous when new voices start to speak. Whether it is Jesus or the unclean spirit, we want to build fortresses. We want to draw lines. But Jesus comes, as He has always come, to tear down the walls and erase the lines. So where do we stand? Are we ready? Are we willing to keep company with this teacher on a journey that in Mark leads to a cross? Jesus taught with authority. And the authority comes from his person. There we see what it can mean to be fully human, compassionate, fearless, loving, with a passion for justice and awareness of what is in the human heart. It is by watching him and pondering his words and his behavior that I too will learn what it means to be human. Are we willing to take this journey, knowing that none of us has any true authority? Any authority that is present comes from the one who leads us. And the word will spread. Let us pray. Though you are God with all the influence and status that the name implies, you refuse to pull rank and parade your power among us. Instead, you chose to step down into our experience, living among us as one of us, with all the struggle and suffering that goes with being human. More than that, you adopted the role of slave, washing feet and serving people of no reputation or social standing, and giving of yourself completely. As incredible as it sounds, you are the God who serves. And we can respond in no other way than to give ourselves to you in praise. Amen.